Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on another lecture of the Elements of Sustainability series. Today's topic is sustainability certifications and public policy, and I'm sure that most of us have stand on the grocery aisle looking at the labels of products we purchase and try to understand what they mean and if they're actually valid. So it is a great pleasure to have today Dr. Thomas Lyon from the University of Michigan to walk us through this puzzling space of certifications, ecolabeling, and public policy. Dr. Lyon is the Dow Chair of Sustainable Science, Technology, and Commerce at the University of Michigan, with appointments in both the Rose School of Business and the School of Environment and Sustainability. He is president of the Alliance for Research on Corporate Sustainability and has served as director of the Earth Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise and as associate director for policy and social science at the UM Energy Institute. Professor Lyon is a leader in using economic analysis to understand corporate environmental strategy, especially in the energy industry, and how it is shaped by emerging government regulations, non-governmental organizations, and consumer demands. His book, Corporate Environmentalism and Public Policy, published by Cambridge University Press, was the first rigorous economic analysis on this increasingly important topic. His current research focuses on environmental information disclosure, private politics, regulatory compliance, and eco-certification. Thank you, Professor Lyon, for joining us today. It is a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Erica. As I hope you can see on your screen, what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes is sustainability certifications and how they're connected to public policy. So I'm going to outline the three main takeaways from the talk, and we'll come back to these again at the end. So first of all, although public policy might often be the most desirable solution to a sustainability problem, there are often reasons why public policy simply can't be invoked for certain solutions, which frustrates both consumers' desires to make a sustainable choice and the desire of companies that want to build a sustainable reputation. Secondly, standards and certification systems can help with that problem, but competition between different standards creates dilemmas. And there are a number of possible solutions to these dilemmas, but unfortunately, none of them are obvious winners. None of them are easy, none of them are fast. So we'll come back around to those, look at those possible solutions, and think a little bit about what might be the best path going forward. So just to set the stage a little bit, why might we need policy to deal with sustainability issues? Maybe the most fundamental and frequent issue is that business transactions often impose damages, what economists call externalities, things like air pollution and water pollution, on innocent bystanders. So people that live in a community that don't even purchase from a company may be exposed to the pollution created by the manufacturing process, and so they're harmed by the market decisions of other players. Oftentimes, we've argued that public policy is needed to step in and force producers to, as we say, internalize the costs they impose on others. If they have to do that, then they'll make decisions that reduce those costs and reduce the amount of damages that are imposed on society. Traditionally, what economists have argued is that this can be done through two different mechanisms, either of which will work. One could be setting pollution taxes or fees. So we put an additional price on production that balances out the harm that's imposed on the rest of society. Alternatively, there could be a standard that just limits the total amount of water pollution or air pollution that can come out of a manufacturing facility. So that's our standard traditional public policy recommendation that we issue in the School of Environment and Sustainability, the Ford School of Public Policy, or here at the Ross School of Business. However, there are problems with that solution. One of them is what you're seeing here on the screen. You look at it, and the word that probably comes to mind is gridlock. So increasingly in our domestic political situation, gridlock characterizes interactions in Washington, D.C., which means not very much gets done. If you look at this chart, which is showing over time from the 1940s to the mid-2000 teens, there's increasing congressional gridlock on important issues, as you see through this line that's bouncing around, but getting worse and worse over time. So often, even though we may need public policy to address an issue, Congress simply finds it impossible to take action because it's gridlocked. Climate change is perhaps the most obvious and pressing example where Congress simply refuses to take the needed actions. So that makes it difficult for public policy to offer a solution. There's a second challenge that is interconnected here too, and that's the globalization of certain types of externalities. Again, climate change is a perfect example. Climate emissions in any country affect the global climate system and affect people all around the world. So that externality is not just harming someone down the street, it's harming people the world over. So the globalization of environmental impacts and the globalization of trade can make it very difficult for governments, even well-intentioned governments, to address certain environmental problems using standard policy tools like standards or environmental taxes. Furthermore, trade law makes it hard for governments to regulate the attributes of production processes that are going on outside their borders. Even if the US wanted to reduce pollution from certain kinds of productions, it can't simply go to China or Mexico or any other country and impose its own desires for regulation. So that, combined with domestic gridlock, makes policy solutions infeasible in a growing number of important cases. So that's frustrating for environmentalists, for consumers that want to buy cleaner products, and for companies that want to build a reputation for green products. As a result, an increasing number of groups have been pushing into a space that we could think of as eco-labeling, international market mechanisms that try to use market forces to solve these problems where public policy is having difficulty gaining traction. So I want to reference a study, a large-scale study that I was part of a few years ago. It was funded by the Packard Foundation as well as the Walton Family Foundation. And what we did was gather together a group of leaders in studying eco-certification. And what we wanted to do was produce a state-of-the-art summary of the state of knowledge about what are the potentials and the limitations of certification. So I'll refer to that study in a number of places as we're going along. It's available on the web. If you simply Google this study towards sustainability, the roles and limitations of certification, there's a 300-page book essentially that's available for free on the web that will give you much more detail on this topic. So what are these sorts of voluntary standard systems? Well, what they do is prescribe a set of rules and best practices designed to lessen environmental damages. So if a company signs on to a certain kind of standard system, it's making a commitment to use these practices, and we then believe it will be reducing its environmental footprint. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on what you can call product level standards. So they apply to a particular product you might see in the supermarket as you're walking along. There's a whole other set of standards that apply to the corporate level that affect corporate reputation and performance, but aren't necessarily visible on the shelf when you're in the supermarket. And we're going to leave that topic aside for another day. When we think about these product level standards, there's two key benefits to them. One, they help consumers identify green products. So there are an increasing number of people that want to buy healthy, sustainable products, but they may need some assistance when they get into the store to figure out which ones to purchase. So these voluntary standards help with that. They also help to build profitable markets for green products, which help on the business side. They help companies to actually find it profitable to move into these spaces. So I'll just give you a few examples that you may have run into in the supermarket. So what you see here is a fresh haddock fillet that's got a certification here, the blue symbol. You can only see it with a little bit of fuzziness, but it says MSC, Marine Stewardship Council. You see the blue fish here, and that indicates that this fish was caught in the wild in a fishery that's been certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. So they're certifying that this fishery is actually used in a sustainable fashion. It's not being overfished. It's going to last for the long term. And Marine Stewardship Council certification has been on the rise for the last 20 years. And you can see in this chart quite a steep increase in landings of fish that are certified through MSC fisheries. So the number of tons now is up to almost 10 million tons of seafood per year. And over here, these small histograms you see indicate that MSC is now about 10% of all global seafood. So it has not completely transformed the market yet, but it's made very substantial inroads into the seafood market. So MSC is a great example of one of these kinds of certification. I'll give you another example. Here's a receipt that I picked up in Paris a year or two ago. On the back, you see this little symbol, FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. And that's an analogous organization to MSC that certifies that the paper came from a forest that's being managed in a sustainable fashion. So it's not being deforested, it's being harvested in a way that can be managed into perpetuity. So FSC is another really common and familiar label. And just like MSC, its use has been growing very rapidly over the last 20 years. So you can see here the total number of hectares, million hectares that are under FSC certification. And you can see they're broken out by boreal forests, temperate forests, and tropical forests. So moving from cooler to warmer and hot or tropical forest areas. So this growth has also been really impressive, and you can find the FSC logo in a lot of places. There are many other examples. Another one that's a little more recent, certified sustainable palm oil. So palm oil is used in many food products. It can be produced in a sustainable fashion, but what's happened in the last 10 to 20 years is that often rainforest is cut down to grow oil palm trees. And in the process, it's a really severe deforestation impact and climate impact. So people have become concerned that they want to buy palm oil from sources that did not deforest rainforests. And so this symbol, the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, certifies products that use palm oil from sustainable sources. One of the companies that has decided to pursue that is Ferrero. In part, Nutella was one of the products that really moved him in that direction because kids love Nutella. Grown-ups love Nutella too. Yeah. This great hazelnut chocolate spread that you put on your bread. So it tastes great, it's lovable, but kids also love orangutans. And orangutans live in tropical rainforests. When forests are cut down in order to grow palm oil, it really threatens the orangutan population. And there's not an enormous number of orangutans left in the world anyway. So this guy right here is giving the thumbs up, apparently, to RSPO certification. And Nutella is only one of the Ferrero products. Kinder Surpreso, great candy for children. There's a little toy inside it. The Ferrero Rocher chocolate is something that many people know and love. So this is a great example of a product that you might find certified when you're walking the supermarket aisles as well. So there's lots of these examples out there. There's just a few. We'll touch on a few others as we go along. One of the things that we need to introduce at this point as just a concept is the notion of a credence good, because it's not something that people ordinarily talk about. Economists and marketing faculty often talk about three types of goods and services based on different attributes. So you can see over here on the left of your screen, products that are high in search attributes, meaning you can go to the store, look at the product, and get a very good idea of what the product is and whether you like it or not. So you can go look at clothing, you can try it on in the store before you take it home. You can sit in a chair, you can examine it, you can feel the texture of it. So you have a pretty good idea of what you're buying before you actually bring it home and put it into use. Here in the middle, there are products that we say are high in experience attributes because you just don't really know what you think of it until you've had a chance to consume it once. So a restaurant meal is a great example. You can read something about a restaurant, you hear something about it, but until you actually go to the restaurant, you don't know whether you're really going to enjoy what they're offering or not. Haircuts are a very similar thing. Your friend might have gotten a good haircut, but until you've actually gone, you don't know for sure if you like this place or not. And then finally, over here on the right, the most difficult to evaluate are things we talk about as having credence attributes. So credence attributes are things where even after you've purchased and consumed it, you're not 100% sure what was the quality. So, for example, you may go and get legal services from a lawyer. You may win your case, but perhaps you don't know. Is that because you had such an overwhelmingly powerful case, or was it that the lawyer was really good? And on the other hand, if you lose, you don't know if it's because you were really guilty or whether the lawyer just didn't do a good job for you. Complex surgery is a similar kind of thing. There's a whole host of products where it's really hard for the consumer to know what was the quality even after they consume the good. So we're talking about sustainability attributes, which are really, really hard to evaluate. When you buy a Ferrero Rocher candy, you have no idea where the palm oil came from. And when you taste it, that doesn't help at all. So you can't search for it. You can't tell by experience. You're trusting somebody's claim that the product was made in a sustainable fashion. In fact, most social and ecological aspects of production are credence goods. So if you wonder whether a product was made with child labor, there's no easy way for you, the consumer, to find that out. You can't search for it. Consuming the good doesn't give you any information. So you have to rely on, you have to place your credence in someone else to tell you how that product was made. So we need an external assessment, and sustainability certifications are especially important for these types of attributes. And I'll just give you a few examples. There are many in the sustainability area. Was the fishery that the fish was caught from sustainable or not? Were dolphins caught in the net, or were other production processes used? Is the forest sustainably managed? Did the palm oil come from a recently deforested part of the tropics? How are workers treated at the factory? Are pesticides or herbicides applied to the food as it's being grown? Are genetically modified organisms used in this product? Was renewable energy used in the production process? None of these are things that we consumers can figure out on our own. So we need sustainability certifications to give us the confidence to know what really happened in the production process. These standards also help to create new market segments. So there's a large number of consumers nowadays who take sustainability into account when shopping. Many of them are willing to pay a price premium. But if they can't identify the proper products, that market segment can't come into existence. So it helps business side of the equation to create a new market, and it helps consumers to get the products they want for their families and for themselves. So that's kind of the underlying set of reasons why we have sustainability certifications. Sometimes public policy can't be invoked, and the credence attributes of products require some third-party certification in order to help us understand what was done. Now, a challenge is that even though these standards and certifications are great in a lot of ways, there's getting to be a very large number of them. And this is only a small fraction of the total number of labels that are out there. Some of them you'll recognize perhaps, like we mentioned, Forest Stewardship Certification, FSC. We mentioned MSC down here. You might recognize the Fair Trade logo. You might recognize USDA Organic, but there are many other logos that you won't recognize and that I don't even recognize. So this starts to create a real challenge for consumers. How do you figure out what different labels mean and which ones are better? So for example, in the paper space, you can get FSC certification, or you can get SFI, which stands for Sustainable Forestry Initiative. How do you know which of those is better? In the fisheries space, there's MSC, but that competes with Friend of the Sea certification. And then there's another certification called Dolphin Safe. So the consumer really has to make some decisions. When it comes to coffee, things really start to get overwhelming. This is one of the products that is certified more than any other. So a lot of coffee will say fair trade on it, which means that it treats the workers producing the coffee beans in a fair way, gives them a fair wage. USDA Organic is also quite a common certification on coffee, and it indicates the coffee wasn't made with any pesticides or herbicides being sprayed on it. But there are also labels like bird friendly, which focuses on the ecosystem that the coffee grows in and whether it's friendly habitat for birds. There's Rainforest Alliance certification that has a mix of ecological and social attributes. And there's UTZ certified that also has a mix of social and ecological attributes. So when you go into a coffee shop, how do you know which of these things to buy? It's very challenging. And even if you figure it out for coffee, there are all these other product categories where you might also wonder what's the right thing to do. So this competition between labels is becoming an increasing challenge. Moreover, labels have different structures. So many of them are binary. What happens is you either get the label stamped on your forehead or your product, or you don't get it. So it's binary. It's either on or off. But there are other labels. Many people are familiar with LEED certification for buildings. I hope you're fortunate enough to work in a building that's LEED certified. But LEED certification comes in multiple levels. It can go all the way from just basic certified to silver, gold, and platinum. And in the EU, if you buy appliances, you can find those evaluated on a grade-like system that goes from D to A plus, A double plus, and even A triple plus. So if you thought labels were confusing enough already, when we have all these different levels, it can get even more challenging. To make things even more complex, ecolabels are sponsored by different types of organizations. So you see here this pink bar indicating that almost half of them are sponsored by nonprofit organizations. But there are also quite a lot sponsored by for-profit organizations, industry trade associations, industry hybrids or social ventures, or by government. So the sponsors may make a difference in terms of what are their objectives and what can you expect from that particular certification scheme. So here's a couple of examples of schemes that are sponsored by non-governmental organizations or NGOs. And I'll stick with this FSC example since we've mentioned that before. Here are some industry-led labels in pulp and paper, tuna, and here's the Forestry and Paper Association, the SFI label that we mentioned before. And these labels don't always get along very well. FSC, sponsored by NGOs, was created back in 1993 after the Rio Earth Summit. And it was created because public policy was not created. These NGOs wanted to see some strong public policies that would protect rainforests. And when that didn't happen, NGOs got together and created this certification scheme. A year later, the industry association, the AF and PA, American Forest and Paper Association, created SFI to compete with FSC because it's more flexible than FSC and maybe easier certification to obtain, especially in North America. And in fact, these groups have kind of attacked each other. The FSC group took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. Now it was back in 2005 saying, how can you trust the timber industry to measure its own environmental sustainability? Isn't that like the fox guarding the henhouse? Simply stated, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative is a historic greenwashing effort to blur the public's trust in eco-labeling, helping loggers appear sustainable when it's really just the same old forest industry. So that's the attack that FSC made against SFI, and they've even had documents and programs produced that argued that SFI is certified greenwash. And of course, the SFI folks have their response to that. But an industry-sponsored label and an NGO-sponsored label are likely to perform differently. And so it helps consumers to know who's the sponsor of the label that you're looking at. So I want to talk a little bit about a paper I wrote a couple years ago about this competition between environmental labels. And it gives us a little framework for thinking about which labels are likely to perform better, and also what's happening in the marketplace when we have competition between different labels. So the idea here is that there are a lot of firms out there in this big global marketplace, and they differ in how costly they find it to go green. Some of them may be well prepared. They can go green and certify at a fairly low cost. Others may find it rather costly or just impossibly difficult. So some will decide to label, some will decide not to. Now we know the market is increasingly willing to pay a premium for greener products. So that's the backbone of the model. It assumes the marketplace wants to sell these kinds of products. Now we're going to allow for an NGO label and an industry association label to compete with one another, and they have different objectives. The NGO wants to minimize environmental damages, so it's strictly laser focused on environmental issues, doesn't really care about anything else. The industry association wants to maximize industry profits, and it doesn't care about anything else. So they're both extreme caricatures, but it makes it easier to understand the forces at work. And the key finding from our research is that label competition may not be so great for the environment. It can actually reduce environmental protection. So let's think about how that could happen. So one of the things that we found was really important is what's the mix of companies that are out there? So in these various diagrams, you think about industries arranged on this horizontal axis according to how costly it is for them to go green and certify to a particular standard. So in this diagram, the first one in the top left, you see there are a lot of firms that have fairly low costs of certifying, but there's a tail out here of firms that are going to have a really hard time meeting the green standards. On the other hand, if we move to this diagram, here in this industry, most of the firms are going to find it very expensive to certify. It's going to be expensive for them to go green, and there's only a relatively small tail of companies that are ready to really move forward and be very green. This third diagram shows a very wide distribution where most firms are somewhere in the middle, but there's a mix at both ends. Then down here at the bottom, we've got three other distributions of firms where it's a narrower distribution, meaning most of the firms are here in this section. So here on this diagram, most of the firms have low costs of going green. This is an industry that's ready to move ahead and green itself. In contrast, over here, most of the firms have high costs of greening, and there's just a small set that are really ready to be able to be environmental leaders. Here, most of the firms are concentrated somewhere in the middle. It turns out this distribution of firms really matters when we're thinking about whether eco-label competition helps the environment or hurts it. So let's think about how competition might play out. One of the key things we found in the paper was that if there was only one label and it was run by an NGO, that NGO would set a tough standard. That makes sense. It's an environmental organization. It wants to maximize environmental benefits, So it sets a high environmental standard. Maybe not all the firms will be able to meet it, but it wants to set that high benchmark. On the other hand, if only the industry trade association sets a standard, it will tend to set a lower standard. More firms will be able to meet the standard, so it will get wider participation, but it won't get as much green action. The practices involved in that standard will be weaker. And that's typically how people think about, say, FSC and SFI. Normally, people will argue that the FSC standard is more stringent than the SFI standard because it's set by an NGO rather than by an industry. So that aspect, I think, is very easy for people to grasp. What happens when we get competition between these two different types of labels? Well, as I said, the NGO will generally set the tougher standard. When we get entry by an industry standard, there's going to be two things that happen. Some firms that were going to label at the high level will now decide, no, I'm going to switch over to the lower, less demanding industry label. That's going to reduce environmental benefits. On the other hand, there will be some firms that are attracted to the certified market now who couldn't afford to certify to the NGO standard, and that is a benefit on the environmental side. So you've got this trade-off between a loss of environmental protection for some firms that would have certified to the NGO standard, but a gain from firms that would not have been in the certified market at all. And the net effect on the environment depends on the balance between those two forces. Interestingly enough, industry profits always increase by having that additional standard. And that makes sense too, because it gives more options for firms. So when we think about the total profits to the industry tends to like having a variety of labels, so a variety of tiers, say, in LEED certification, because it gives firms of different types options that can work for them. So when we go back to these distributions of firm costs, what were the places where competition might actually be damaging? We found two situations, here and here. So in either of these situations, most firms, because they're concentrated in one set of costs, most firms would be able to meet the demanding standards set by the NGO. So here, most firms have low costs of greening. They can follow the NGO standard. If we add an industry standard, a lot of them will be drawn off, except the weaker standard put forward by the lower tier, and net environmental benefits go down. Similarly, over here, if most of the firms are clustered in the middle, a single NGO standard will fit most of their abilities or needs. And if we bring in a second weaker standard, it drains off environmental benefits. On the other hand, in these situations where there's a wide range of firms, it helps to have two different tiers because the leaders can go for the tough standard, the firms that haven't quite gotten that far can go for the weaker standard, and on balance, that improves environmental performance for the whole industry. Similarly, in this case, where most of the firms are still in the world of having high costs of improvement, we kind of need two standards. You can have the industry standard for these high cost firms, and then the NGO can set kind of a boutique standard for that small set of firms that can really afford to meet the tough standards. So when we think about label competition, it's crucial to realize it's not necessarily good for the environment. It will tend to be beneficial if the cost distribution of firms is wide or if it's skewed to the side where most firms have high costs. And from a corporate perspective, label competition is always good for industry profits. So that's worth keeping in mind. So let's go back to this concern that there's this growing number of labels. It's not just two labels necessarily competing in a given sector. There may be 5, like we see in coffee. One of the concerns is that consumers just become confused. So this little cartoon referring to the Tower of Ecobabble suggests all these different claims that you might be seeing on products. And it can just get overwhelming. I know I feel like when I go to the supermarket and try to figure out which eggs to buy, there are so many different standards for eggs. Is it cage free? Did they eat organic food? How big is the amount of space each chicken gets to walk around in? It can get very complex. So this can start to become something where even with the best intentions, labels may not have the impact we hope because consumers simply don't know what is going on. So I want to share with you some findings that the Federal Trade Commission um, observed in a research study that it funded a few years ago. They hired a company called Harris Interactive. It's a surveying polling firm that's very well known, very well established. And they had them ask consumers, what do you infer from certain types of labels? And you can see from the pictures that I've put here that it may not be as clear as we'd hope. So if consumers see a general green claim, something that just says, this product is green, 27% of them will assume the product has no negative attributes whatsoever. That's a non-starter. I challenge people to come up with any product that has no negative environmental impacts. They may be small, but it's almost impossible to make something that doesn't have an impact on the natural environment. So this is a bit of a crazy presumption for people to make, but they make that presumption. 61% will assume it definitely or probably has recycled content. 53% will assume it's biodegradable. Almost half will assume it uses renewable energy. 40% will assume it's compostable. So people see this big, vague claim, something is green, and they make up a lot of inferences about it, which may or may not be accurate, even if they see a much more nuanced and specific claim. So this product is green, made with recycled material. A good third will assume it has other green attributes at all, even though the product was very careful to say, this is the one claim we're making. And even if the claim is only for a specific attribute, recycled materials, 23% will assume it's got green attributes that go beyond that. So there's a real danger of consumer confusion here. From a business perspective, this could be seen as something that's beneficial because people will think my product is greener than it really is, even if I put just a vague label on it. But that sounds good in the short run and isn't necessarily good in the long run because over time, people gradually figure out whether you're greenwashing or not. So I don't think even for business, this is an advantage over time. You don't want people to be confused about what your product offers. Usually businesses want consumers to be clear about the value proposition. So one of the concerns that can happen is some labels are not as legitimate as others. Sometimes companies even make up false labels that are just manufactured to slap on the outside that say sustainable product, but it's not third-party certified, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything at all. One of the big things to watch out for is the word natural. You see that on a lot of different products. It turns out the word natural doesn't have any agreed upon meaning. So companies can use it to mean whatever they want, and it may not be delivering anything that you, the consumer, thought you were looking for. I've noticed recently there's another term that's coming into use called clean, which also is completely undefined. So my advice for consumers, when you see the word natural or clean, go the other way. Worry that you're being fooled because somebody's not willing to be honest and specific with you. So what are some solutions to this problem of the proliferation of ecolabels, some of which are more stringent than others and some of which might be fake altogether? Well, one, the good labels could eventually start to mutually recognize each other. So FSC and SFI might say, okay, I recognize the other one is basically doing the same thing I am, so we're going to sort of engage in a harmonization through that process. That's possible, but progress on those lines is usually slow. There's not much evidence that that's been happening in the eco-label business. And for good reason. Each time somebody creates a new label, there's some reason they're doing it. It's going to be a little different than somebody else's label, usually. So this is hard to make happen. A second possibility is mergers between labels. This is what we see in the business world. You get a lot of entry into a market, and then there's a shakeout. And the best firms tend to win. They may acquire some smaller firms, and they build up some really strong brands. We'd think this might happen in labels too. But again, unfortunately, this is very, very infrequent. I can only think of one example where this has ever happened. I'll tell you in just a second. So this is not an easy process. And I think part of the problem here is that most of the labels are sponsored by nonprofit organizations. They're already not making any money, so merging together won't increase their profitability at all. It'll go from 0 to 0. Whereas in the business world, a merger stands to offer you higher profits if you bring two firms together. That doesn't necessarily apply in the world of ecolabels. So they don't have very much incentive to merge. Finally, we come back around to public policy. Maybe in the end, we really need to get through government regulation. And maybe private standards are a step on the way toward government regulation. Or on the other hand, maybe they preempt the possibility of government regulation. So I want to go into that in a little more detail. First, to mention the one merger between ecolabels that I know about, there was this recent one in 2017 between two of the big labels in the coffee space, and they're in other food spaces as well. Rainforest Alliance and UTZ decided to merge, creating a stronger organization. I thought this was great. This was really indicating that these guys are looking for a pragmatic impact on the ground, and they're trying to really maximize that. So that's the one example I can think of. It's encouraging, but I wouldn't wait for everybody else to follow along that strategy. The other thing that happens, as I mentioned, sometimes private standards lead to government regulation along the way. This chart is a little complicated. It's kind of cool because it's showing you the history of organic farming over time from 1900 into the early 2000s. And there are a lot of different forces that come into play. Organic farming actually has been going on for quite a long time, but certification of that was a slow and difficult process. So what you see here was the emergence of organic certification. But what happened initially was that states would do their own organic label. So California would have one, Massachusetts would have one, Vermont would have a different one. And then organic farmers have trouble if they produce in California and want to sell in Vermont, their label's not necessarily recognized in another state. So eventually the Organic Farming Association pulled together, created a lobbying campaign and went to Washington, D.C. and said, please, we want a unified federal label that will have the same standard across all the states. And so that was how we got to USDA as a national standard. It was very much the organic farmers themselves that went to DC and said, we want to rationalize and have a single standard. So that's one possible way out of this proliferation. And it's what led us to this logo that you see very frequently, the USDA organic logo. So I want to turn now to this question of whether private standards preempt government regulation or whether they prepare the ground for public policy. I'm going to share with you some research done by other people, but it was such cool research. I wished I had done it, and I thought I should share it with other people. So this is a neat paper by 3 faculty members at Stanford that looks at exactly this question. Does private regulation preempt public regulation? So the idea was they did a survey. They had thousands of participants in it, and they were asked, how does your support for regulation on a particular topic change if industry takes private action? And it differentiated along a couple of different dimensions. So one, is that action broad in scope, meaning all the firms in the industry participated, or is it narrow, just a handful of companies do it? Second, is it deep, meaning it really represents a profound change, or is it shallow? We're just tinkering around on the margins. So those are the two different categories, setting up four different possibilities. Now I'm going to overwhelm you with an incredibly complicated looking graph, so pay attention for a moment. So here it is, but there's a ton of insight available in this one graphic, so we'll stay here for a minute. So the first thing you notice is the three verticals. So one of the cool things was that these guys surveyed members of the National Audubon Society. So they got environmentalists in one survey. In another, they got people that had signed an environmental petition. So they had also shown a commitment to environmental causes. Thirdly, they had a broad survey that went kind of to the mass public. And the thing you know, the other thing to describe here is there were 6 different issues. So fishing practices around bluefin tuna, vehicle fuel efficiency standards, genetically modified foods, neonic insecticides, so all those pesticides that kill bees, plastic packaging, and wind turbines. So a broad range of environmental issues. And in each case, they would ask in the survey, do you support regulation to strengthen this environmental concern? And then they would say, well, how do you feel if now industry has taken private actions? And so in each case, the thing you're looking for here is along this horizontal axis at the bottom, what's the net impact of the private action on people's support for regulation? So if we see a minus 30, it means 30% of people are less supportive of regulation after the private action happens. And there's a broad pattern that you see quite consistently here. We see moves like this that really reduce support for regulation. And here in this first example, broad and deep and broad and shallow both significantly reduce support for regulation. On the other hand, narrow actions, whether they're deep or shallow, didn't have very much impact. Same thing was true for vehicle fuel efficiency. Similar stories for basically all of the different environmental issues. And it didn't really matter much whether it was Audubon members, petition signatories, or the mass public. The same general story typically holds true. In fact, oftentimes the environmentalists were more readily satisfied by private actions than were the mass public, which is pretty interesting. But there's a big takeaway here, which is that even shallow voluntary initiatives can often be enough to preempt government regulation. Now, let me go back for a second to say on this. So broad and deep initiatives, we would think we'd welcome, but almost as effective are broad and shallow mechanisms in terms of preempting government regulation. So there's a warning sign there. There's a red flag that these industry efforts, if they're shallow, may preempt public policy even when we really need public policy. So that's a very interesting takeaway, something that should give us a little cause for concern. I want to share with you one other study done by a group at Northwestern's law school, and it's similar but different in some very interesting ways. And in their study, they were looking just at what happens if a single firm takes action, or maybe a government, a local or state government takes action. How does that change people's belief that we need public policy? So this is another one of these papers where you can tell the story with a graph, which is great. I love those kind of papers. So in this first example, what we see is people's support for government regulation to restrict battery cage egg production, meaning when hens are trapped in very small cages where they can hardly even turn around. So would people support a regulation to block that sort of production process? And this is laid out along an axis where we've got very liberal people on the left, very conservative people on the right, and then the vertical axis is telling us to what extent those people agree we needed government regulation. So the base case is this blue line with the little X's on it that says, you're just told that there's a debate between two different sides about the virtues of these battery cage production processes, do you think there should be regulation to outlaw them? Not surprisingly, very liberal people were more likely to say we should outlaw them. Very conservative people were less likely. So that's our baseline. Now suppose people are told, well, the state of California has already moved ahead to eliminate these battery cages. Do you think we should have regulation? And interestingly, everybody across the political spectrum decides, yes, I now am more convinced we need regulation. And in fact, it had a bigger impact on very conservative people. So it's interesting. It's like the state of California is considered a credible leader, at least on this type of issue. Now, finally, look at the red line. So this says, suppose McDonald's moves ahead on its own voluntarily and says, we're not going to buy eggs from producers that use battery cages. If people are told that, how does that change their feelings about regulation? Well, very conservative people now are really convinced that we need regulation. They take that as much more indicative of a real problem than if the state of California takes the action. On the other hand, you move over here to the left side of the diagram, very liberal people now think, well, if McDonald's did it, it must be bad. So now I'm less likely to support regulation. So it's very interesting because the way people interpret private actions, including standards and certifications, may depend on their political persuasion. Now, just to complicate this one more step, we'll look at a different issue that these folks also looked at, and that is regulation of antibiotics given to livestock. So should the government regulate to stop meat producers from using antibiotics? Same basic background here. So the blue line is the baseline condition with the little X's. So you're told there's a debate about the use of antibiotics, but not told anything more than that. What fraction of people agree we need regulation? That's shown by the blue line. And again, liberals are more likely to support regulation than conservatives. Now on the green line, suppose you're told New York City has decided to ban meat with antibiotics in it. Well, liberals are much more likely to say, oh, well, in that case, I believe we really should regulate. But very conservative people, on the other hand, now say, oh, God, if New York did it, it really must be bad. We'd better not regulate at the federal level. So it's very interesting, again, those politics. But now from a corporate perspective, in this example, they said, suppose Walmart took the action. In this case, again, everybody takes that as a serious move and says, well, in that case, I believe it's a real issue. We should probably regulate. And interestingly, liberals are more persuaded by Walmart's action than are conservatives, which is surprising to me. But Walmart was viewed as credible across the whole political spectrum, whereas McDonald's was viewed as credible by people who call themselves very conservative, but not by very liberal people. So it just goes to show how complicated the process can be of drawing inferences. So people go to the store, they see a particular standard or certification, and they may draw some very strong conclusions, which may be based in part on their own politics. So that tells us something about whether private action is likely to lead to government regulation or not. So we're seeing two different effects. The first study said, well, private action may convince the public the problem is being taken care of, so we don't need to regulate. So all these standard systems and certifications might be serving that function. On the other hand, the second study shows us that private action can convince people that we really need to regulate this particular issue. And whether that convinces people or not may depend on citizen ideology. So private action can drive things toward regulation or away from it, depending on a variety of factors. So it's just an inherently complex kind of world. So I want to just take an example from the chemical industry. So I want to point to something called TSCA reform. So it was a political change, a piece of legislation to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. So this happened a couple of years ago, and it was viewed as a huge bipartisan accomplishment because Congress almost never agrees on things nowadays, especially not with regard to the environment. But this was almost unanimously passed through both the House and the Senate. And here's an article written by Fred Krupp, the president of the Environmental Defense Fund, saying, "This is a story of bipartisanship that'll make you believe maybe government can actually work." So very impressive, a very unusual kind of legislative accomplishment. The Atlantic magazine wrote an in-depth article explaining how did this actually come about? What were the factors that led to it? Because it is so remarkable when something like this happens nowadays. Just as way of background, in case you weren't familiar with it, TSCA was passed in 1976, and at the time, over 60,000 chemicals were already in use. And it was impossible for the EPA to suddenly say, well, we're not going to use any of these chemicals now unless they're tested and proven safe. That would have put all kinds of products out of commission for possibly decades. So we've really had just a terribly disruptive impact on the American marketplace. But over the last 40 years, EPA has only required testing of 250 out of those thousands and thousands of chemicals. So not much was getting done. And it only placed restrictions on 9 chemicals out of 40 years out of these 84,000 total chemicals. So I think this act was widely viewed as relatively toothless and having almost no impact. Really not like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. This one just wasn't written in a way that had much impact. So people had been realizing for quite a long time we needed to reform it. And there were a lot of factors leading to that reform, and I'm not going to go into all of them. I just want to mention this one. Was there a role of private regulation, private standards in driving us toward this TSCA reform? And I think in this case the answer was yes, and it comes in large part from our old friend Walmart. So people have been saying Walmart is becoming the new Food and Drug Administration because Walmart doesn't have to take 20 years testing chemicals to prove they're safe or hazardous. They can just say, if customers don't want BPA in their baby bottles, we're not going to sell it. So they can make those decisions much faster than EPA or the FDA can do. And Walmart has started to become, in effect, the de facto regulator. And Walmart has phased out a number of hazardous chemicals from products that it puts on its shelves. So private standards were being created, promulgated by Walmart. And I think you can make a pretty good case, and this article in The Atlantic makes the case that because Walmart was already making companies test chemicals and start to remove the hazardous ones, it reduced the opposition to having the government do it. And in fact, companies might think having the government do it would at least be more systematic. We'd have a voice in it. We'd be guaranteed that science is really behind it. And so I think in this case, the private regulatory response helped pave the way for government regulation to step in. So as we step back and think about this range of topics we've been talking about, sustainability certification is important because it gives information about credence goods and it builds new markets. So those are great things, but competition between those standards creates dilemmas and may actually reduce the impact of standards. There are a number of possible solutions, including harmonization of standards, mergers between them, or government regulation. But none of these is an obvious winner because none of them are easy, and you don't see any of them happening very often. Government regulation is the most powerful of these, and the thing that's interesting and like a nuanced and difficult question is, when does private action through certification preempt public policy? When does it pave the way for it? There's no general answer. I can't give an answer on that. But what I've tried to do instead is just introduce you to the set of issues that sustainability certification is trying to solve and how those connect to the world of public policy. It's a complex system, but it's one that's addressing really important issues. So Erica, I'm happy to take a few questions if you have some things you'd like to zero in on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lyon, for such a insightful view of ecolabels and all certifications. That was a lot of information. And
Yes, Sandra.
as consumers, it is difficult to understand all the labels. So how can we differentiate between a strong and a weak ecolabel and one that is actually helping achieve what they set themselves for?
So there are a couple of things that can help people. The Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, has a website that rates different eco-labels. So you can go Google NRDC eco-labels, and they will tell you which ones they rate as really strong, which ones they think are not so good. That's one source. Another thing you can do is get your phone and download an app called Good Guide. And that gives you a little interface where you go to the store and you can read a UPC code, and it will actually tell you what are the social, environmental, and health implications of that particular product. So that can give you a deeper insight into choosing between different products.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, obviously, there are competing agendas for all types of organizations, and however, it is great that there are programs that are looking to improve the practices of specific sectors. But can eco-labels transform a market and make it more sustainable, or definitely we need government intervention to achieve that?
That's a great question. Eco-labels certainly help. They improve a market. I think there's no question about that. You look at MSC certification, for example, we're up to 10% certified. If you add to that the Friends of the Sea eco-label, which is about another 10%, we've got almost 20% of seafood now being certified to those two labels. And of course, there are other labels out there too. There's a Monterey Bay Aquarium label. So there are several of those, but they are definitely making a difference. The thing they can't do is force out the really bad actors. So they're voluntary. They work on the basis of a pull, but sometimes you need a push to actually shut out the really bad guys. And that's where, so far anyway, we've never really come up with a good substitute for government regulation.
Okay. So obviously, to make this kind of transformation at the market and industry level, you need different levels and different types of goals depending on the firm that you are looking at. And so what about certifications at the company level instead of the product level?
Yeah, the chemical industry is a really interesting place to look for that. A lot of industries have an issue with something you could call collective reputation. So consumers hear about one company having a problem, and then they forget who it was, but they just think, well, it was somebody in the chemical industry, so they're all bad, right? So the good actors have really strong incentives to try to get everybody in the industry to certify to a set of practices that will help them avoid accidents. So in the chemical industry, for example, there's something called responsible care, which I'm sure you're very, very familiar with. Dow has been a leader in creating that. DuPont has been involved for ages. But the issue is trying to get the smaller firms in the industry to sign on to responsible care. So they're trying to create this broader collective reputation that'll go for the whole industry. There's another version of that that goes vertically through a company's supply chain. So you may be a firm that faces consumers, but you've got a long upstream supply chain, and some of the actors in the upstream part may be small. They don't want to certify. They don't want to adopt best practices. They may say, I can't afford it. There's another certification in the chemical industry called Together for Sustainability that's more focused on supply chain performance. And it came out of Europe, really. But Together for Sustainability is trying to get suppliers to sign on to that. And they may say, well, I'm an American company. I don't really care about the European market, so I'm not going to bother with signing on to it. And then later they may change their mind because they wish they could get into the European market. So you get labels like these or standards at a corporate level that help to ensure that the company's reputation doesn't get damaged by actions that others in the industry might take. And it also helps the company just develop a set of best practices that will prevent it from running into sustainability difficulties in the future.
Well, this has been definitely a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon, for shedding light into some of the moving parts behind the development of certifications, eco-labeling, and even public policy. There is definitely more to it than it meets the eye. So I hope that this lecture brought as much clarity, has curiosity to research about the certifications and ecolabels you tend to look for in your products so that you get engaged in the discussion. Because at the end of the day, even though sustainability can be complex because it requires collaborations among many stakeholders, it is not really abstract or unmanageable. So by joining these lectures, you are already taking a pivotal step toward being an intentional agent of change, one that is informed and engaged and is ready to be part of the builders of a flourishing world, that world that we all want to see. So happy Earth Day every day. That is all for now.